My name is Randy Hollick. I'm the Manager of Marketing and Communications at the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba. Welcome to our webinar this morning, Rise of the Machine Age Act 2, Transformative Global Impacts of Machine Learning and Digital Transformation. We're really excited to have a deeper discussion about this very important topic today, and we really appreciate the fact that you've joined us here today. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, one quick note about your ability to participate in today's webinar. We'd ask you to please use the chat function in Zoom. We'll closely monitor that chat and incorporate any questions into the discussion as best as we can and as time permits. I'd like to now take a few moments to introduce you to today's panelists and our moderator for the webinar. Each one of them has played an important role in helping to develop two of our newest programs scheduled to be launched in the new year. Their certificate in building information modeling will roll out next September, and the micro certificate in artificial intelligence machine learning solutions is open for registration now, with classes scheduled to begin in January. Our first panelist is Brianna Brownell, who is founder and CEO of Pure Strategy, Inc., a technology consulting company and AI software development firm. She is a data scientist turned tech entrepreneur, investor, futurist, and innovator, and is widely considered to be a visionary technologist. Welcome, Brianna. Our next panelist is Jason Shields, who is an assistant professor of interior design at the University of Manitoba. Jason's work primarily explores the relationship between architecture, technology, and the built environment, and his current research examines the role of virtual reality, mixed reality, and AI-generated virtual environments in interior design. Jason.
Thank you very much.
And our third panelist is Kerry Kumar, who's the Associate Dean Academic in the Division of Extended Education at Kerry's portfolio centers around programs, partnerships, and strategic engagement, and she leads the team responsible for the development of new continuing and extended education programs for lifelong learners. And finally, our moderator for today is Rod Lastra, the Acting Dean of Extended Education at Rod's current scholarly interests are alternative credentials, lifelong learning, micro-learning, skills qualification frameworks, and assessing post-secondary credentials as drivers of social economic mobility. I'll now turn things over to our moderator to get today's discussion underway. Rod.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to begin by providing a little bit of a historic context in order to frame our discussion. I think it's really important. I think it's really important that we kind of understand the title of what we are about to embark in. So in terms of the context, our species is around 300,000 years old. And during this history has been marked by a handful of, what I call inflection points throughout our history. The first was the emergence of intelligence around 45,000 years ago, which really radically changed the way that humans interacted, humans communicated, culture, everything else. The second, perhaps, could be argued was the emergence of agriculture, roughly around 10,000 years ago. And the third was the Industrial Revolution, or the Machine Age, which started around 250 years ago. Now, this last event is extremely significant in our history, for it changed everything. Up until that point, humans relied on energy derived from biological metabolism, fueled primarily through energy captured via photosynthesis. The Industrial Revolution supplanted the limits of that kind of energy capture with energy derived from burning coal to generate steam. This energy powered the machines of industry and setting off a course of unforeseeable radical change over the next 250 years, which we're still experiencing to this day. This change brought on massive global disruption, including a spike in population growth rates, which I will add, interestingly enough, this past Tuesday, we passed a milestone globally of 8 billion people on the planet and growing. We are now posed to experience a fourth massive change where human cognitive power, not power generated through muscle, but cognitive power will be extended or perhaps supplanted by machines. What the future holds is going to be interesting. And what this discussion will hopefully begin to unravel is ways that we can begin to understand what the immediate future will hold for humanity and society as a whole. So I'd like to turn things over to our panel for some opening comments, beginning with Brianna, Jason, and Carrie.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rod. This has been, really interesting to prepare for. And I love your sort of historical, discussion about where, we've been as humans and where we might be going with AI. Because I really think that the future of AI and the ways in which that it can augment our sort of cognitive functions is really, really important. So I know that a lot of people look at artificial intelligence as sort of something that's a little bit scary. So I know my mom thinks that I developed killer robots, right? That's one of the things that everyone immediately comes to mind when we think about AI. But I really want to challenge that. And I want us to think about the ways in which we can use some of these technologies to make us more human, not less human, to be able to ensure that the things that matter to us are a part of the technology development of artificial intelligence. So my background working in AI for, I started in the sort of data science area in machine learning about 15 years ago. The speed at which some of these things are happening is absolutely, absolutely amazing. So when I think back to where we were when I started my career, things were exciting back then, but now the speed at which we're getting faster development, new capabilities is only accelerating. Because we can see the ways in which these artificial intelligence technologies can actually do things that we thought were the exclusive domain of humans. It's interesting to think about things like chess. So chess has been one of those areas that has been heavily, there's lots of AI that have gone into sort of AI chess playing. And it's easy to forget that when all that development was going on, people were extremely skeptical of the fact that an AI could actually competently play chess. Chess was actually considered a very, very human endeavor. It was considered something that took human intuition, it took creativity, it took a deep understanding of your opponent in chess. And as soon as artificial intelligence was able to solve some of those problems and competently play chess, we immediately sort of moved the goalposts. And we said, okay, well, chess maybe isn't so human, but what about Go? And we know what happened there. AI basically was able to very competently play Go and actually teach us something really important about the way that that game worked. So being able to add something sort of surprising. So then we move the goalposts again. And now we're looking at things like AI created art. We're looking at AI created music. We're looking at all of these things that we believe is the exclusive domain of humans, and artificial intelligence is encroaching upon all of them. And so I think this is the perfect moment where we can think about how we want the future to be and how we want technology to play into it. So what are the things that are very human-like? What are the things that are sort of deeply felt in our heart that we want to make sure sort of remains a major part of humanity? And so it's very exciting where we are now, but it's causing us to really rethink all of things like, you know, what the workplace is like, who creates art, what, you know, entertainment projects are like. And so I'm incredibly happy to be here to see what, you know, happens in the next few decades and where we get to after that.
Thanks, Brianna. And that's extremely interesting. It certainly raises a lot of important questions with respect to our space and our domain that we hold so dearly in terms of what is human. Jason, so from your perspective, can you give us some insights in terms of what you do?
Yeah, and thanks again, Rod and Brianna, for that introduction there. I think much of what Brianna says, I'm going to actually expand upon in a sense, because a lot of the work that I do relates directly to the field of architecture, and in my case, being an interior designer, the built environment. And so what we've seen, similar to what Brianna was just mentioning, is this proliferation of technology has really changed how our industry functions, and also changes a lot of how the research that I do functions as well. So much of the work that I look at looks at how we use virtual reality or mixed reality to function within virtual spaces. So an example that I can give that's fairly straightforward is we'll often work with students who will design their entire building in a 3D program. We could use, for example, something like Autodesk Revit or Trimble SketchUp, formerly known as Google SketchUp. That student information could then be easily relayed to a virtual environment. So whether that be through virtual reality, when you're placing on a headset and you go directly into this new space, what this allows for in our instance is for students to be able to engage with space that hasn't not yet been created. It also allows them to manipulate, move, look at metadata of the space in real time rather than viewing this in a two-dimensional screen. We've started to take this a bit further most recently in our department as well, with the integration of mixed reality headsets. So mixed reality headsets differ somewhat from virtual reality, well, in a sense that the most popular version being the Microsoft HoloLens. You place this object on top of your head, and you're able to see the physical world, but it also overlays digital information on top of it. And so what we've been able to do with this as well is you could just have any table, like if you see the table behind Rod there, you could place a mixed reality headset on, and all of a sudden you've populated all of these different architectural models. We're able to look at them, scale them up, pick them apart, pull them apart, and start to make iterative design decisions. So this is something that we've been examining quite a bit in our field most recently. Furthermore, another great thing that we've started to see is the integration of interior scanning. So using point cloud information or point cloud data. This is something that was quite difficult to do many years ago, just due to the cost of it and the intensity of actually integrating that into the programs. Now, myself, I'm able to just walk around space with a very large unit on top of my chest, but it can scan everything in every direction. And then I can then take and extrapolate that information to work with architectural models or to define different parameters or information. To kind of get back to that as well, when we're doing this, we're often doing this in a program that uses building information modeling. And building information modeling is, as mentioned earlier, is one of the extended education's new programs. And this is something that architectural disciplines have been focusing on quite a bit recently. And building information modeling allows for a much more holistic approach to design, where in the past, when I first started, you'd be drawing it on vellum, you'd be using your sketch table. We eventually moved into kind of AutoCAD, which is a two-dimensional computer representation of it. And now we've moved into BIM, which is a multi-dimensional representation of that. So you've seen this evolution and how technology has begun to affect our field so intensely. What I'm beginning to get very excited about is something Brianna also mentioned there, is the role of AI learning. We've seen it really begin to get popular in relation to the creation of images, but I look forward to seeing what role that may have when creating 3D environments that are generated through AI prompts. So this is something that we've begun to be researching in our discipline as well. And so I think that as we see these technologies further develop, the role of architecture is going to be a very important one, because we must remember, as all of us speak here today, we're speaking in a unique built environment. And for those of us who design these tools have become very, very important. But we must remember, you have to understand those fundamentals before you're able to properly use those tools to its greatest extent. And I think that's going to be one of the larger questions that come about through these discussions, is that AI and these certain tools cannot just replace the ability of what humans have, but how can we use their skills to augment our previous existed knowledge? So that's kind of where we're standing with that. And I gladly would speak more to it, and we will speak more to it as we go on here today.
Thanks, Jason. Carrie, from an educational standpoint, can you provide a little bit of your insights?
Sure, thanks, Rod. So my current work is focused in continuing education and lifelong learning. So that's sort of the domain of higher education that I work within. And so in our work, we serve a very diverse population of learners, and we offer quite an array of different programs. So our programming, provides development in terms of academic, personal, and also professional needs across a lot of different topic areas. And so we've recently been branching out into some tech-focused programming. So that's how we came to connect with Jason and Brianna. So we're really grateful for that. But I would say in general that continuing education is a rather unique domain within higher education. And I do think that we have a really critical role to play in terms of responding to the skills gap that digital transformation is really exacerbating at the moment. And one of the things I'd like to share is that really a defining feature of what we do in our work, which I think is really relevant to today's conversation, is that we're synergists, right? So in our work, we're continually assessing educational needs, and we're sort of generating ideas in terms of programming that can be helpful with respect to those needs. But when the magic really happens in our work is really when we work together, and when what we try to do from our end is we try to create the conditions to allow for these synergies to happen. And so what I mean by this is that, we're really going to be most effective in our work when we're engaging with a diversity of perspectives. So we want to bring in subject matter experts from within and beyond our institution. We want to engage with prospective learners, with industry, with employers, with our own institution more broadly. And then we sort of add our own expertise into the mix. We kind of stir this up, and we hope that we've created some conditions where we get some synergies happening and some creative outputs. Because really from the perspective of educational providers, I think creativity and innovation are really important when we think about how to respond to and think about the impact of AI and digital technologies in higher education. Certainly, we know that digital transformation is exacerbating the gap between the skills that the employers need and the skills that the workforce has. We also know that industry is probably changing faster than higher ed can respond to in traditional ways. So we really do need to be creative. One thing that I think is really interesting is that there are some new technological skills that are important, but also there are a lot of other skills that aren't necessarily new. These are sort of those human-focused skills, right? But these are things that they become so important, and it's so critical that we weave these kinds of elements into our programming, perhaps, and emphasize them in ways that we haven't done before. So in our work, one of the things that we're working on currently is really sort of exploring and really experimenting with different kinds of programming. One of the things that we've been thinking about lately is working with shorter credentials, what we call micro-credentials, and thinking about even how non-credentialed programming can really respond to the need that's out there. Also, while thinking about making sure that the educational experiences that we create are accessible to our learners as well, in terms of, so curriculum is critical, but so are things like program duration and program cost, again, thinking about who our learners are. And I think as we think about how we can identify and how we respond to the needs that are out there, one thing that's really important to us as education providers is that we're very mindful and aware of our own niche. So from our perspective, we are a continuing education unit situated within a university context. So just to go back to that example of the short programming that we're interested in exploring, when we're pursuing this, we're thinking about really finding that sweet spot between the practical and the technical. Oftentimes we know that, skills are very much a focus of our programming, but we also want to incorporate those theoretical elements that you would expect from a university level program. So I think one final point that I want to make, just to provide, again, just some food for thought as we start our discussion, is that, again, when we're thinking about the impact of AI and digital technologies on education and how we respond as educational providers, in my view, I think it's helpful to think of higher education as a system rather than necessarily focusing on our own institution and our own role in isolation. I mean, I've been talking about what we do more, focusing, I've been sort of doing the opposite just now, talking about what we do in continuing education. But I said, we're synergists, right? And I think that ideally, even in our work, of course, that synergy should also extend to, mixing in, adding into the mix the perspectives and the roles of different educational providers as well. Because I think that this is a critical area and a challenge that we need to work at, is we need to get better at working together. And I think there's a lot of opportunity when we work together to respond creatively to the educational needs. So I think maybe that's a good segue into the rest of our conversation. I mean, that we're here, we have a diverse group of panelists here to put our collective heads together and talk about this some more. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Rod.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Brianna. So I'm going to begin by actually maybe jumping off on the point that Carrie just mentioned. And it's, I think, a point that both Jason and Brianna were kind of getting at as well, is this idea of extension, this idea of augmentation, this idea that Carrie just mentioned, that it's not just tech skills that we need to look at into the future, but it's cognitive skills. And actually, there's been great research in this area of medicine, where there could be some supplanting of digital transformations in medicine. But where does that leave doctors? It doesn't push doctors out. It actually requires doctors to be much more engaged with their patients on a one-on-one basis. So maybe the diagnosis is done by a machine, but the one-on-one medicine, not the systemic medicine, could be, radicalized a little bit more. But in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit about intelligence. And in order to do that, we need to really understand what artificial intelligence is and what machine learning is. Now, before I go to you, Brianna, with a specific question. One of the things we also need to be aware of is that these concepts are not new. So just like the steam engine and the revolution of the Industrial Revolution, the Romans had the steam engine. The concepts have been around for quite some time. It's the scalability and the operationalizing of those things that become the radical change that we see. We know that virtual reality, we know that the ideas of robots were written in books and sci-fi books in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So this concept of artificial intelligence is not new. So for those who are participating in this event, Brianna, can you maybe provide them with a very clear distinction? And there is relation between artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because, if we look at the history of artificial intelligence, at the beginning, machine learning was very rarely, if ever, actually integrated into an artificial intelligence system. So I want to start a little bit by sort of clarifying what AI actually is, because there's a lot of confusion around it. And there's actually a lot of debate in the field right now. So there is no one singular definition of AI. And the reason for that is that the word intelligence has different meanings for different people and different groups of people. So if you think about the way that the initial artificial intelligence was conceptualized, intelligence really meant something human-like both in the output. So you may have heard of the Turing test. And the Turing test is essentially, can an AI system mimic the conversation of a human? And that was sort of the test of whether something was actually AI. Then we had neural networks, which were also created in sort of the 50s, and there's a long history of development in that area. And the idea around that is to mimic the cognitive functions of human brains and basically build that logic into a computer system. So the initial conception had a lot to do with humanity. Because when you think of it, we call ourselves Homo sapiens, right? So what is the most important thing about us? It's our intelligence, right? But since then, we've actually really widened the definition of intelligence within AI. And we think about intelligence both as a way to do human-like things, but also a way to optimize and sort of abstract things that are sort of optimization or other decision-making that, you know, create some desired goal or some desired result. And so within the field of AI, there's these two sort of conflicting ideas. One is a sort of more general view of intelligence that's sort of a lot wider, and one that has to do with AI looking specifically at how humans do things and how humans think. And so moving now to machine learning, we have another term that trips us up, and that's the word learning. So what does it mean to actually learn? So in machine learning, instead of having a system of sort of abstract rules that are programmed, what we can do is we can learn rules from data. And so the reason that that's important is because a lot of the sort of older AI systems that were very sort of rule-based and that were, you know, optimized based on some kind of like specific algorithm to maximize something, we don't have to explicitly know those rules in advance. And most of the time, they're so complicated that we don't know those rules in advance. And so what machine learning allows us to do is to use data to essentially create those rules or to add emergent structure to some kind of data set. And within that, we can put it inside an AI decision system in order to get the results that we want. And so for me, machine learning is really fascinating because when I started my career, data was really scarce. It was very difficult, expensive, sometimes even impossible to get the data that you needed to do the analysis that you wanted. I remember when I did my thesis, I was told that the data set that I would need to test it was flat out impossible to get. Like it's just would never ever happen. But now I sort of look back and think, you know, you probably could actually collect data in order to sort of do some of these things. So the amount of data and the amount of different kinds of data and the amount of connected data has really made machine learning explode in popularity. And that's really helped the AI tools because many of them rely on machine learning.
Thanks, Brianna. And I think you raise a really important point, and that is our definition of intelligence, and where we're at with that. I mean, I think a lot of the artificial intelligence that we have right now is something called narrow artificial intelligence versus generalized, which maybe if you want to maybe quickly comment on the difference between the two.
Yeah, definitely. So artificial general intelligence is something that a lot of people, including myself, are thinking about. Most of the AI systems that we've created can do one task really well. And they're trained to do that one task really well. And they either sort of surpass, humans, like Rod mentioned, diagnostics, for example. So that's one area where AI has performed extremely, extremely well. But if you think about it from the context of, the doctor, so the doctor is looking at the medical images, they're doing a diagnosis maybe based on those images. But, that doctor can still recognize their grandma. They can still drive home after work. They can still do so many other vision-related tasks aside from that specific diagnostic element. And so when we think of something like general intelligence, we want to have an AI system that can not only do one task like diagnosing skin cancer, for example, but can also, recognize a person, can also, drive home, for example. And so being able to build a AGI system or a more general system even is something that, organizations have really just started doing. There's been a few attempts to it, But for me, that's extremely important because it allows you to sort of generalize concepts in a much more sophisticated way. And arguably, that's how our intelligence works as well.
Thanks, Brianna. I'm going to go to Jason next, and I want to kind of build on some ideas here. So, pace of change. I think Brianna mentioned the rapid exponential geometric rate of change when it comes to the adoption of these technologies is something that's really mind-boggling, and I think that's where the radical thing happens. I'll give you an example, and I'll lead to my question. AlphaFold is a piece of software that's being used in science to be able to model molecules, specifically proteins, and to develop new proteins. And scientists can now do in literal minutes what took them months or even longer to be able to generate. And the positive implications of that are huge. There are some concerns. Half jokingly, if Linus Pauling had his hands on artificial intelligence technology like this, he perhaps wouldn't have been recognized for his discovery of the molecule of protein structures as he was. But my question to you, Jason, is this: with the rapid change of these abilities, such technologies have to be put to use to solve a problem. Within your research field, how do you think these technologies will radically change the spaces in which we live and address kind of our much more global problem of sustainability and global climate change? Is there something there that we can begin to extract?
I think there's actually a lot there that we can begin to extract. And I think I'll probably talk quite a bit about sustainability. But the first thing I wanted to mention on that topic is what I find interesting is, in a sense, there was a large transition, and I mentioned this earlier, from this idea of kind of two-dimensional drawing to multi-dimensional modeling. And being at kind of that early stages of that, I saw a lot of apprehension, both from not as much the academic sector, but a lot of the professional sector not wanting to kind of integrate some of these larger ideas at first. And what I think is interesting about that question, Rod, is that we're now at a stage where these have now been integrated, and I think people are now realizing what type of strength some of these automated approaches often offer. And so I'm going to go over a couple examples that I think are really strong and relate directly to the field of architecture, but come back to larger ideas like interpersonal connection and sustainability at a larger scale. So as I mentioned earlier, we work a lot with building information modeling, and that's a multi-dimensional tool to work on architectural or construction projects. And one interesting thing that we see with that often is that now we're able to build the model, we're able to share the model across a multitude of different stakeholders. So for example, I could have an engineer that's halfway across the world, and I could have some other stakeholders that are in Asia and another stakeholder in Europe, and we could all be looking at that same model at the same time. Previously, what we would probably do is we'd probably all fly to a different location, we'd probably meet up and we'd go over that drawing set and we'd discuss that. What this allows for is, if we're looking at a very large kind of win, is that reduction of carbon footprint that's required, where a lot of this can now occur within virtual space. We can actually do a lot of the testing as well for the construction methods within the virtual space as well. So this is reducing the amount of footprint that, generally speaking. And so I'm starting at kind of a larger general topic, and I'm going to start to narrow that down to some more defined examples. What we also begin to see is machine learning is beginning to be integrated into material selection. And Brianna may know something about this or read about this as well, as this is starting to become a bit of a newer construct within our field. Through that dossier, I guess, in a sense, like you were speaking of, Brianna, that a large amount of data that we now have and are able to access, we're able to look at how material is being used or how material is being also logged. And so what that can be doing is to actually reduce the amount of endangered materials that are being used. We're able to have a better idea as to how forestry is being functioned, and then how we actually utilize those constructible materials afterwards. I think probably the most interesting component that we're seeing now, and it's starting to get talked a lot about the last couple of years, is this idea of a digital twin. And the digital twin is brought up in a multitude of different fields, but within the architectural field, I find it to be quite unique. So to give a kind of a very simplified definition of what a digital twin is, it's a digital twin is like a virtual replica of a real world design project. So imagine you have your real world building, it's been constructed, but you also have a virtual building on your computer. And so what can happen there is it can range from a variety of different scales, whether it be, just a small laboratory to a large building to an entire urban park. And what that typically does is it composes of 3 different elements, which is usually be visualizing, forecasting, and diagnostics. And that's what occurs between the physical building and the digital model. So for example, if there is ventilation issues or if there is some other interior kind of safety issues, what can happen is the actual physical building will have sensors or other respondents that will tell that digital model, hey, there's something going on here. And so you are able to be at your computer and actually be seeing what the building itself is doing and functioning, and you're able to respond to that. If you're looking at it at a bit of a higher level as well, it begins to integrate a multitude of different topics that we talk about here today, which is, for example, IoT, which is the Internet of Things, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and in fact, there's a big data analytics. So what we're starting to see here is it's not only that we build the building, and before, we would do a post-occupancy analysis, kind of talking to the users that use it, analyzing how the building has responded to the site and the situation. But now we're actually able to gain that data immediately through these systems. And so what it does is it reduces the amount of cost, it reduces the amount of time that you have to respond to these issues. Now we see an immediacy to it. And I think it's really actually helped increase sustainability as well, because now it really cuts out some of those elements of guessing, where you're having people come down, analyze the site, see what's going on. The computers are able to tell us that very quickly. And so when you send someone down to the site or to the building, they know exactly what that problem is, and they're able to respond to that in an even quicker manner because that data has already been provided directly to them. If we look at kind of some of the other, I would say, exponential experiences that are happening right now as well, I see like a really good interpersonal connection that occurs with mixed reality. So, for example, some individuals who may have disabilities may not actually be able to access the building, whether that be through site conditions, traveling conditions, so on and so forth. These technologies can allow individuals who may not have had that opportunity before to still feel engaged with that, and especially to feel engaged with that design and creation process as well. So what we've really seen here is the technology has augmented some of the existing kind of skills and factors that we already had in architecture, and it's brought it to a much higher level. And what I would argue is that it allows us to better analyze buildings and to better analyze it for factors such as sustainability, accessibility, and it just allows for a more holistic and a more communicative design approach. It's not that the computer is doing the work by any means. The computer is informing you and providing much more data for you to make strong, informed decisions. So I think I'll kind of pass it off over to Kari there. So thank you, Rod.
Thanks. And before I go to Carrie, I mean, I'd like to build on something that you said, which I found really intriguing, and then I'll go to Carrie, which is this whole idea of a digital twin. And Carrie, this is going to lead into our question. This concept that you raised, Jason, is a really important concept because conceptually it's been scaled up at a global level. In other words, the idea of taking urban spaces and in digital ecosystem spaces and really to begin to understand the interconnection of processes at a level that actually does begin to address our impacts within our natural environment and trying to interlace those complex processes, which in the past we couldn't do. We had to segment that out, but with artificial intelligence, there is that possibility. So, Carrie, not the digital twin concept, but the concept of scaling technologies. We oftentimes think about education as responding to meeting the need. But let's step back for a moment and let's talk about the implications of how technology has changed the face of teaching and learning. 1990s, for example, was the rise of the computer age. And really that brought with it the Internet of Things, online learning, MOOCs, a lot of so-called revolutions that really slightly altered what we do. From your perspective, where do you see this digital revolution impacting education in the future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of potential for digital transformation to take place in higher education. At this point in time, I mean, in higher ed institutions, we're really starting to think about creating digital strategies. So we're sort of proactively thinking and creating and strategizing rather than necessarily just sort of responding or adapt, or, as new things come along. And I think these kinds of strategies are going to be really important for the long-term sustainability of our institutions. We need to be adaptable, we need to be flexible, and at the end of the day, we need to be competitive as well. So it's really important. And I think that there's certainly a lot of interest in thinking about how technologies and also how institutional data can really be thought of as strategic assets for the institution. And so, you asked specifically about, changing how we teach and learn. Certainly, digital technologies are already ubiquitous in the classroom, right? We have the learning management system. This is a hub for our course materials and those kinds of things. We have a number of multimedia tools that are being utilized. And I think Jason gave some really great examples of some sort of cutting edge ways we can use technology. And that's really great. We have a number of synchronous and collaborative technologies as well. I think there's potentially some other additional new and exciting things that we may be able to achieve with AI and digital technologies. For example, is there a way that AI-driven software can help us to really better understand how our students are engaging with learning materials? Can that help us to think about, are there additional ways that we can sort of help to customize the learning experience to better meet the needs of our students? I think, that's an interesting question. I think so this idea of adaptive learning, can AI provide us some support in that respect. I think in general, working with perhaps there are new ways that we can work with learning analytics to really help us make data informed decisions. I think there's certainly a lot of value there. Another thing that's really of interest to us in higher education is, of course, protecting the academic integrity of our programming. And so I think there's also some interesting work happening in terms of smart plagiarism detection systems. One thing I want to go back to, which is something that Jason shared, and Jason talked about mixed reality, and so mixed reality and virtual reality. I think these are some really fantastic ways that we can enhance the learning experience for students in a variety of fields. I mean, I used to teach anatomy and physiology, and wouldn't it have been amazing if we could use VR and look through some of these body systems? That would have been so amazing. And I think that's great. And Jason also made the point about accessibility, right? And thinking about, well, maybe this individual might like this mixed reality option that might be more accessible to them than visiting the physical, building space. At the same time, I think it's really important that when we think about these innovations and when we think about using new technologies, that this is that sort of that ethical piece and that human side of things, right? Like, let's be really careful when we think about what we're going to implement and why we're going to implement it and how we're going to implement it, so that we make sure that we're creating equitable learning opportunities, because certainly technologies can enhance accessibility in a lot of really wonderful ways. Even just thinking about the multimedia applications that we use in our courses, we can provide content in written form, we can provide videos, we can have automatic captions. These things are really cool, but we need to think about making sure that we're not inadvertently creating barriers for some individuals, right? So I think equitable learning opportunities and accessibility, I think those are some things that we really need to be mindful of. It's great that we're getting really excited about all of these possibilities, but I think we just need to be really responsible in terms of how we implement technologies.
Thanks, Carrie. And I think you raised a really nice point there at the very end. I think that there is a possibility, although there is a possibility that could slip by us, that we need to look at the equity, perspective here. And I think one of the things that's been a long-standing mantra of education is that we tend to teach education from a myopic lens. There is a possibility that technologies could provide a means to be able to meet the learner where they're at, and to provide tools and technologies that will do that will be able to assess individuals and move them at the individual level. And so really kind of radically changing, where we need to be. For this next round, I'm going to ask for some quick bites. And I know that this is a big question or a big ask here, but some quick bites. So with the idea of education in mind and skilling in mind, Brianna, if you had to lay down, realizing it's complex, it's not clean, a couple of skills that would be required in the immediate future, what do you see as emerging trends in the skilling arena?
So I think it's interesting because while there's so many amazing possibilities around AI, the area that I see a lot of challenges right now is be able to link the technologies and the sort of those possibilities to important business outcomes. So if you look within organizations, most AI projects still fail. So that's not a good place to be in when you're, very optimistic about AI. The reason that these initiatives are failing is because it's very difficult but critical to link it to strategic business outcomes. And that's where the gap is. So yes, technical skills are important, but what I think is even more important is being able to understand the ways in which AI technology and any technology can really impact those business outcomes. So not just doing it because it's cool and new and interesting, saying, okay, these are the strategic outcomes that we want, and this is how technology, digitization, and AI tools are going to help us get there.
Thanks, Brianna. That's great. Jason, same kind of question, but slightly different. If you had a crystal ball and you had to pick, and now this is impossible to pick because disruptive technologies you can't predict by definition. But what would you say would be one thing that could be a radical change in your field in the immediate future?
I'll give you the quick bite answer here, Rod, and there's going to be two that I think that will be important. One that's already occurring, but I think is going to take a lot more kind of a forefront, and that's going to be the creation of generative design ideas. So these are going to be based on machine learning and input parameters. So to put it simply, say I want a space and I want that space to have 5 chairs, a desk, and a window. That's all I tell it, and it will give me 6 different iterations or versions of what that could possibly look like. We already have something of that right now. Sometimes people are apprehensive of it because they think it's doing their work, but just using that as a tool to actually be able to create these iterations and then refining from there. And then the next one that I think is very important, and I see some questions in the question part related to that as well too, is the idea of AI automation. And that's the creation of images using AI and then relating that back into 3D space. However, I think it's opening up like a multitude of questions in relation to ownership and copyright. And so ethics, all those kind of come into play there. But I think that's going to be a big thing on the forefront, especially within our field and the related fields of art and graphic design.
Thanks, Jason. And actually, there's a really good point here to underscore with what you just said. Patent laws internationally are based on human design. So when a machine does it, who owns it?
That's going to be the big question, I think.
That's the $1 million question. So Carrie, back to you. Value proposition for higher education. So let's get back to the pragmatic for a second. If we are to respond, and this is a quickly changing environment, skills are required. As Brianna and Jason said, there are changes coming around the corner. What do we need to do in higher education in order to become a little bit more innovative, a bit more responsive? What are the radical changes that we need to do there?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps there are some radical changes. I think part of it too, though, is being mindful of what is our particular role with respect to these changes. Again, so I come back to what I mentioned at the beginning about thinking about our niche, right? So, if I'm speaking from the perspective of university in higher education, I mean, I think that, our fundamental role really isn't changing in the sense that we're helping to develop a skilled workforce and also a critical society. That's really important. So if I think about, and sort of earlier we talked about, there's the need for technical skills, but we have to remember about the human skills as well. We talked a little bit about ethics and responsibilities when we use new technology. So I think what's really important for us in terms of how we respond at this point is thinking about what's the soft skills and the certain abilities and aptitudes that are also really important. So when we think about who we're graduating from our programs, I mean, I certainly when I talk about these critical soft skills, I'm talking about things like complex problem solving, critical thinking, leadership skills, and so on, and those kinds of things that they're critical today, but which are going to help our graduates really apply their knowledge in various ways and across different settings. And I think one thing that really sort of stands out to me is, I think all of this conversation, it really brings to me the importance of critical agency to the forefront, right? We want our graduates to be critically reflective, right? We want them to question, and we want them to challenge these technological advances and the impacts that they can have on society. At the same time, we want to educate them in terms of the skills that they need, both to be capable of incorporating them strategically into their various fields, and also we hope that they can do so with some excitement, right? So we want our graduates to be excited about these possibilities, but also to think critically about them as well. So I think in terms of us being innovative in this space, I think some of the challenges for us is then thinking about, well, how can we be creative in how we design and deliver our programming to achieve this? Because some of what I've been talking about, I mean, some of these abilities and competencies, these can be some of the most challenging things to learn and to teach and to assess, right? So I think in terms of our innovative response, I think we're going to be thinking carefully about what are the forms and the combinations of learning experiences that we want to provide our learners. I think that we're going to see a demand for more of a variety of different types of learning experiences. And I think that what we need to do as educators is to be more creative and think about how we can expand our repertoire of what we offer.
Thanks, Carrie. And I think you touch upon an important idea here, which is when we're looking at our response, we need to appreciate future. What does the future mean? Right? The future is kind of this term that's applied to like a future state. Could be tomorrow, could be a second from now, could be 100 years from now. So when we're trying to be responsive to future trends, we need to be very precise in terms of what we mean by that, because we oftentimes we'll get it wrong. I'm going to throw a very general question out to the three of you, and this is kind of a composite questions from the chat, and that is mimicry. The ability for artificial intelligence to mimic art, the ability for like artificial intelligence, like large language models to really mimic writing, right? To mechanisms to mimic video. The implications of that are pretty huge, but they go back to a really foundational thing, Brianna, that you mentioned at the very beginning, which was the difference between general AI and narrow AI. And at the moment, we're still at the narrow spectrum. We're still trying to mimic, in fact, we're still trying to mimic childlike ways of cognitive learning. In fact, there was a great paper that was written just recently called The Biological Underpinnings of Lifelong Learning, where lifelong learning is a biological thing, meaning that we learn through experience, organisms learn through experience. Getting computers to do that is really difficult. So talking about the implications of mimicry, the implications of using AI for artificial environments, any thoughts on that in terms of the moral implications of all of this?
So I've worked quite a bit with the large language models. And one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that as of yet, all of the generated text has a risk of being completely non-factual. So Galactica was a model that came out like within the last few weeks. And what it did was it essentially wrote a lit review of a paper on whatever topic you wanted, right? So, I'm thinking, okay, this is actually really useful. I do want to read a literature review about, a topic I'm interested in. But the issue is, it doesn't actually genuinely generate a literature review. It basically creates papers that don't exist. It misquotes papers that do exist. And it creates this really strange hybrid of, false information, true-ish information, and some actually legitimately true information. And so I really think that it comes back to asking ourselves what the purpose is of building some of these models. So what is the use case? What is something that we can do with it that actually is meaningful and matters? And so the danger, I think, is really because developers are not always thinking about that. They're thinking about, hey, this is kind of interesting, why don't we try to do it? Rather than saying, well, what could be something that matters that
Mhm.
we could build using some of these AI tools.
Jason or Carrie, anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think an interesting portion, at least in our end, is I completely agree with what Brianna was saying there. It's like you need to know what you're using it for and what to expect from the outcome. But I think the one thing that I find, and it's something that is even difficult to gauge in the human world, is that you can't really necessarily replace aesthetics or taste or kind of conceptual approach where, you could tell it, okay, make me this beautiful image of this interior. And you can give them all these parameters, but that computer necessarily doesn't have kind of taste. And I think that's where it often will come down to, is if you don't understand what you're asking of the computer and you're just saying, I'm going to use AI to generate this, it will give you something back. But if you don't have any type of filter to actually look at it and say, well, this isn't very good, or this isn't making sense, then we're in a really bad situation. Because where Brianna spoke, she was able to read through it and say, wow, this is a really not an acceptable literature review. What it's telling me is not accurate. But if someone who is uneducated on that topic did the same thing, they could read it and say, oh yeah, this looks great, great job. And then, hand in the paper and realize, well, none of that information was correct. And you have to use that tool accurately, just like any other technology. And that's where my biggest fear comes, is that there is this overriding public thing that AI can just solve these problems. It can solve them, but it may not necessarily solve them accurately.
Exactly. Thanks, Jason. Carrie?
Yeah, and I think a lot of what's been discussed also can relate to how we make choices about which educational technologies we implement. Again, thinking very carefully about, why we're selecting a particular technology. And I think another point to make as well in terms of the impact of all of this in higher education is, I think we really need to recognize the importance of providing support to to those who are on the front lines in the classrooms. And here I'm referring to recognizing the value of, our teaching and learning centers, our instructional designers, the technology specialists, really in helping us to make the most informed decisions and really to think through the implications of the choices that we make in terms of technology.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I think this has been a very encapsulating conversation, but, obviously we can go on for another few hours because there's many things to talk about, but we don't have few hours to do this. So we're going to have to wrap it up there. One of the things that we will do is I think that we will look at the questions that have been posted on the chat and we will address them. And I think any other points that the panel feel that we should like to put out there, I would recommend that we articulate that in writing and put it on our webpage so those visiting our website can come back and we can fill in some gaps. Again, a very interesting conversation, but a conversation that is near impossible to encapsulate in 60 minutes. Randy, over to you.
Thanks, Rod. So on behalf of the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. As Rod said, we will be posting the answers to the questions. Also, you will receive an email next week with a link to the recording that you'll be able to find on that same webpage. And we will additionally be sending out a brief survey following today's session, just to give you an opportunity to share any additional comments or questions that you might have. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you again at any of our future webinar events.
Thanks, Randy. And again, once again, Brianna, Jason, Carrie, thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your thoughtful responses, and take care, everyone.